Welcome to the deep dive. I think a lot of you are here because you really want to cut through all the noise,
Mm.
and you want to understand what's really shaping the world. But you don't want to be drowning in data all the time. And that's kind of what we do here. And today we are jumping straight into something well, it's really fundamentally changing how kids are growing up. And it's being called the great rewiring of childhood.
That's right. Think of this as like your fast track to understanding this huge, pretty significant shift really happening right now in the lives of young people. And we've got we've distilled a lot of fascinating insights from a book called The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood by Jonathan Haidt, which, takes a really in-depth look at all the research and data behind all of this.
So, our goal today is pretty straightforward. It's to unpack this whole great rewiring thing for you, identify the core trends that are at play, and, maybe get you thinking about what all this means, for the generation growing up right now and for the future.
So this great rewiring, what does it actually entail? Well, at its core, it's driven by two powerful trends
Mm.
that they've become really deeply interconnected.
Okay. Well, let's dive into the first of these trends, and that is the emergence of, we can call it the virtual world. Back around the turn of the millennium, there was a lot of excitement about the internet and all these new technologies arriving, and there was a lot of optimism, wasn't there,
Yeah.
about how these tools could be a force for good and connection and bringing more information to people.
Yeah, I think the initial vision for these internet technologies really did emphasize increased connection and communication. This virtual world that began to take shape really had some distinct characteristics.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, communication increasingly became disembodied, relying primarily on language and potentially even involving interactions with artificial intelligence, And then secondly, interactions shifted towards being more asynchronous. That means they weren't happening in real time. So think of the difference between sending an email and having a conversation face to face.
Right, you send something off,
Yeah.
and you're not necessarily expecting an immediate response. What else defined this virtual space?
Well, it also featured large communities, often with anonymous participants, and very low barriers to entry and exit. So you could easily join an online forum or a social media group and just as easily leave. And finally, communication was mainly one-to-one or one-to-a-few at any given moment.
Okay, so a fundamentally different environment compared to the real world that we evolved in, and how does that contrast, with our natural social development?
Exactly. So our evolutionary history is deeply rooted in real-world interactions that are embodied, synchronous, and typically, occur one-on-one or within small, stable communities where there are tangible social consequences for damaging relationships.
Hmm.
So the key insight here is that our brains, evolved for face-to-face interaction, are now navigating a world stripped of those vital nonverbal cues.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because Generation Z, so that's those born after 1996, they're the first generation to have spent their entire adolescence immersed in this radically different virtual environment.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating here is the analogy Haidt uses. He compares it to being the first generation to grow up on Mars. So just as Martian gravity would be a mismatch for bodies evolved on Earth, this virtual world represents a pretty significant mismatch with the environment that our, social and psychological development is adapted for.
It's a powerful, powerful way to think about it. Okay, so you mentioned a second intertwined trend in this great rewiring. So what's the other critical piece of this puzzle?
The second crucial element is the decline of what Haidt terms play-based childhood
Hmm.
and the simultaneous increase in overprotection in the real world.
So what is a play-based childhood?
Well, it essentially involves kids spending a significant portion of their free time playing with friends in the real world
Right.
through embodied synchronous interactions within, relatively stable social groups. So this kind of unstructured free play, as Haidt emphasizes, isn't just about having fun. It's actually fundamental for healthy development.
So how so?
Well, across all mammal species, free play is vital. It allows young ones to encounter and navigate small-scale challenges and setbacks.
Right.
So it's almost like a form of inoculation, building resilience and equipping them to handle bigger difficulties later in life.
Hmm. So what led to this decline of this, essential free play?
Well, the decline kind of began in the 1980s and really picked up speed in the 1990s in countries like the U.S., U.K., and Canada.
Hmm.
And there was a growing fear among adults, particularly concerning dangers like kidnapping. And this led to, much stricter limits on unsupervised outdoor play. Even in my own circles, I've definitely noticed how much more cautious parents are now compared to, the previous generation.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear about that a lot. And this restriction of outdoor play, it kind of happened around the same time that personal computers became more widely available for kids, which offered, another way to spend their free time, albeit a very different, kind of engagement.
Exactly. And this connects directly to the rise of overprotection.
Yeah.
So we've seen what's been called safetyism, this idea of a culture that prioritizes safety above, all other values, sometimes to an excessive degree, and also concept creep, where the definition of harm has expanded beyond physical injury to include emotional discomfort.
Right.
So this has led to this tendency to kind of shield children from even, minor risks and challenges.
So we've got these two major shifts happening in parallel, right? So kids are spending more and more time in a disembodied virtual world and less time engaging in free, slightly risky, play in the real world, all under, the increasing supervision of protective adults.
Right. And that sets the stage for understanding some of the concerning mental health trends that we've observed in recent years.
Yeah, and those trends are pretty stark. Let's look at the data. We're seeing a really significant rise in mental health issues among young people.
Absolutely.
Right.
So if you look at the percentage of U.S. teens aged 12 to 17 who reported experiencing at least one major depressive episode in the past year, the data from around 2012 shows this really dramatic upward turn. It's almost like a switch was flipped.
Yeah, and it's not a gradual increase. The numbers are pretty alarming.
Yeah, for both boys and girls, the increase since 2010 is roughly 150%. So that means the prevalence of depression more than doubled in a relatively short period. And by 2020-21, an astonishing 1 in 4 American teen girls had experienced a major depressive episode in the previous year. And unfortunately, the data suggests things might have actually worsened even further in 2021.
Wow. That's a really sobering statistic. And it's not just depression, is it? We're seeing other mental health challenges on the rise as well.
That's right. So data from the American College Health Association shows a really significant increase in internalizing disorders, primarily depression and anxiety, among college students throughout the 2010s. And these conditions started at a higher rate than other mental health issues and showed a much more substantial increase, both in relative and absolute terms. So essentially, the majority of the rise in mental illness on college campuses during that decade stemmed from increases in anxiety and depression.
So there's a distinct generational aspect to this as well, right?
There is. So if you look at surveys looking at feelings of nervousness, the surge is primarily concentrated in Gen Z, with some impact on younger millennials. The youngest cohort, which Gen Z started entering around 2014 in these surveys, show a sharp rise in reporting feelings of nervousness most of the time, or all of the time. Older generations show much more stable trends. So this isn't just some general societal increase in anxiety, it's disproportionately affecting the younger generations.
So it's not a rising tide lifting all boats equally when it comes to anxiety. It's really hitting that younger demographic the hardest.
Exactly. And this isn't just an American phenomenon either. Research examining the 5 Nordic countries, reveals very similar patterns of increased psychological distress in teenagers after 2010. So if you look at their data leading up to the start of, the Great Rewiring, there's no clear indication of this problem. But by 2015, it's clearly evident.
Now, earlier on, there was a focus on cognitive distortions as a primary explanation for mental health challenges in young people. So how does this broader crisis kind of fit with that perspective?
Yeah, so while the idea that certain academic trends might have inadvertently promoted unhelpful patterns of thinking, that had some validity. But the sheer scale of this mental health crisis is much larger and more pervasive. It's affecting adolescents across, different educational backgrounds, socioeconomic statuses, racial groups. It's a much broader societal shift than just changes in cognitive frameworks.
And, right around the time that all of this was unfolding, we also had the widespread adoption of smartphones. And were there any connections that were noticed early on between those two things?
Yeah. Initial research did reveal a correlation. Relatively soon after smartphones, particularly iPhones, became, commonplace among teenagers, rates of depression began to climb. Conversely, more time spent in face-to-face activities like participating in sports or religious groups was associated with better mental health outcomes.
But of course, as we've discussed, correlation doesn't automatically prove causation.
Precisely. So while this early evidence was suggestive, it didn't definitively establish that smartphones and social media were, directly causing the increase in mental health issues.
Mhm.
But as more robust data has emerged over time, I think the picture's become significantly clearer.
So, which brings us to kind of the heart of the matter, which is how this phone-based childhood, is actually impacting development. And so let's delve into what Haidt identifies as the four foundational harms.
Right.
So we've seen these alarming mental health trends. Now let's get into, why Haidt believes this is happening. So what are the specific ways that he thinks this phone-based childhood is impacting development?
Well, these are the key ways in which the rapid shift to smartphones with high-speed internet and social media apps has negatively affected boys and girls of all ages. The first is social deprivation.
Okay, so social deprivation. How is a childhood seemingly more connected than ever actually leading to less social interaction in meaningful ways?
Yeah. Well, the data unequivocally shows a sharp decline in the percentage of U.S. students in 8th, 10th, and 12th grade who reported meeting up with their friends almost every day outside of school.
Hmm.
And this decline really accelerates after 2010.
So even though young people might feel like they're constantly in touch online, their real world in-person social interaction is significantly decreasing. And, is this a difference between, the quantity of connections and the quality of connection, perhaps?
Exactly. And some of the crucial research by Jean Twenge supports this. Her
Uh,
work indicates that teenagers who spend more time using social media are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and other mental health disorders. Conversely, those who spend more time engaged in-person group activities tend to report better mental well-being.
which intuitively makes sense. There's a different kind of social nourishment you get from, being physically present with people.
Absolutely. And the American Time Use Study also provides compelling data, revealing a recent sharp drop in the daily time spent with friends, particularly for the youngest age group surveyed. So it highlights this real shift in how young people are spending their leisure time.
Okay, so the second foundational harm you mentioned is sleep deprivation. And we all know how vital sleep is, particularly for teenagers who are still developing.
Absolutely critical. Teenagers typically need around 8 to 9 hours of sleep each night to function optimally. However, data reveals rising rates of teens getting less than 7 hours of sleep, with a significant upward trend resuming after 2013.
And the consequences of this widespread sleep deficit are quite serious, aren't they?
They are. They're far-reaching, and they can have a significant impact on all aspects of a young person's life. So these include an increased risk of depression, anxiety, irritability, cognitive deficits affecting learning and memory, poor academic performance, a higher likelihood of accidents, and even an elevated risk of death from accidents.
Wow. And the third harm is something that feels incredibly pervasive in our hyper-connected digital world, and that is attention fragmentation. And I definitely notice my own struggles with staying focused now that, my phone is so central to my day.
Yes, attention. So the ability to focus on a single task while resisting distractions. This is fundamental for maturity and the development of good executive function. But smartphones, with their constant stream of notifications and endless possibilities for switching tasks, they act like kryptonite for our attention spans.
Yeah. It's incredibly difficult to, maintain focus when your phone is buzzing or pinging every few minutes with some new piece of information.
Precisely. And many adolescents receive hundreds of notifications per day, meaning they rarely have even short periods of uninterrupted time for focused thought. And there's growing evidence suggesting that this fragmentation of attention in early adolescence,
Mm.
largely driven by excessive social media and video game use, may actually interfere with the healthy development of executive function skills.
That's a concerning thought with potential long-term implications for cognitive development. And then the fourth foundational harm is addiction, which is something that we hear quite a bit about in the context of technology use.
It is, and the developers of the most successful social media applications have skillfully employed behaviorist principles, particularly what's known as variable ratio reinforcement schedules, to effectively hook users.
Hmm.
So think of how animals learn specific behaviors, in anticipation of unpredictable rewards.
So it's like playing a slot machine. You keep pulling the lever because you never know when you're going to hit a winning combination.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And dopamine is released in the brain in anticipation of these unpredictable rewards. And the brief pleasure from that release, doesn't bring lasting satisfaction. Instead, it creates a craving for more.
Yeah.
And in apps with seemingly bottomless feeds of content, there's no natural stopping point.
And this isn't just a byproduct of the technology. There's evidence of deliberate design to maximize engagement.
Absolutely. The Facebook files, for example, revealed internal documents showing Facebook's conscious use of these techniques to keep younger users engaged,
Yeah.
even with an understanding of adolescent brain development and potential harms. And this is particularly concerning because adolescence is this critical period of rapid brain rewiring, which makes them much more vulnerable to these addictive designs.
And the signs of this tech-related addiction, seem to mirror those of other behavioral addictions, right?
Exactly. So addiction researchers like Anna Lemke, for example, highlight that the universal withdrawal symptoms include anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and this general feeling of unease or dissatisfaction, which is called dysphoria. And many adolescents are developing behavioral addictions to social media and video games that share these characteristics with addictions to things like, gambling.
Yeah.
And this leads to, really significant negative consequences for their overall well-being, their social lives, their family relationship.
So these four foundational harms, so social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction, they paint a rather concerning picture of the potential downsides of this pervasive phone-based childhood.
Yeah, and while these harms affect both genders, it's really important to recognize that they often manifest in different ways for girls and boys.
So let's begin by looking at the impacts on girls, and it seems like social media in particular has a very significant influence.
It does. So social media platforms are fundamentally designed around the sharing of user-generated content and the pursuit of external validation through likes, comments, and followers. And this dynamic appears to have a more pronounced negative impact on girls. Correlational studies consistently demonstrate a stronger link between the amount of time spent on social media and the prevalence of internalizing disorders like anxiety, depression, specifically in girls.
Is there a noticeable difference in the amount of time that girls and boys typically spend on these platforms?
There is. The data indicates that girls tend to spend significantly more time on social media compared to boys. And they're also more likely to be what researchers classify as super users engaging with these sites for 40 or more hours per week.
So that's basically a full-time job's worth of time spent on social media.
It is.
That's a staggering amount of time. What are some of the specific mechanisms through which social media might be, exerting a more negative influence on girls?
Well, one key factor is chronic social comparison. So the constant exposure to curated and often idealized versions of other people's lives on social media can be incredibly damaging to girls' self-esteem and body image. Additionally, social media can unfortunately facilitate what's known as relational aggression, so things like gossiping, exclusion, and cyberbullying, which can be particularly hurtful in adolescent social dynamics.
We know how emotionally damaging those kinds of social dynamics can be, especially during that sensitive period of adolescence for girls.
Exactly. And then there's the phenomenon of contagion of emotions and even mental health challenges through social networks. So observing peers expressing anxiety or depression online might inadvertently normalize or even amplify those feelings among girls who are already vulnerable.
And what about the impact on close friendships for girls? How has the rise of social media affected the depth and quality of those connections?
Well, research suggests a decline in both the number and the perceived depth of close friendships for both sexes since smartphones became widespread. However, for girls, the quality of their close friendships is particularly crucial for their overall well-being. So this shift towards having a larger number of more superficial online connections seems to be contributing to a significant increase in feelings of loneliness among girls. It's a case of quantity not necessarily equaling quality when it comes to social connection.
So it sounds like, while boys are also definitely impacted by the great rewiring, the specific challenges that they face might have a slightly different character.
That's right. So while girls experienced a more sudden and pronounced increase in in internalizing problems like anxiety and depression. Boys' mental health decline has been more gradual. However, there's this clear and concerning trend of boys increasingly withdrawing from engagement in the real world
Yeah.
and investing more heavily in the virtual realm.
Yeah. And we've seen some interesting data regarding boys and their attitudes towards risk-taking, haven't we?
We have. So there's been a noticeable decline in the proportion of boys agreeing with the statement, I like to test myself every now and then by doing something a little bit risky.
Mm.
And this decline is actually steeper than it is for girls. So this could be indicative of a broader disengagement from real world challenges and this increased focus on the often less risky environment of the virtual world.
Yeah. It almost seems like certain industries recognize this shift in attention and actively targeted this demographic.
Exactly. So the analogy of attention as the new oil is very apt here. With smartphones in the pockets of nearly every adolescent, companies rapidly shifted their focus to mobile applications, offering this endless array of high stimulation activities. Video game developers, pornography providers, social media platforms, all adopted these free-to-use models, specifically designed to capture and relentlessly hold user attention.
And pornography seems to be a particularly significant draw for boys within this virtual landscape.
It is. So the readily available and often anonymous nature of online pornography presents this clear risk of addiction, and it may contribute to a preference for easily accessible online sexual gratification over the complexities and uncertainties of forming real world intimate relationships. And there's even emerging evidence suggesting that heavy pornography use can in some cases make real women less attractive to heterosexual men and correlate with lower levels of interpersonal satisfaction.
That's a potentially concerning, long-term impact on their ability to form healthy and fulfilling relationships in the real world.
It is. And with the ongoing development of the metaverse and increasingly sophisticated AI companions, the potential for further isolation from genuine real-world intimacy for boys is a real concern, because these virtual girlfriends and boyfriends, can offer these seemingly intimate connections without the messiness and demands of real human interaction.
But it's not entirely negative within the virtual world for boys, is it? I mean, video games sometimes get a bad reputation, but there can be some cognitive and social benefits associated with them as well.
That's a fair point. So some research has indeed shown that moderate video game play can be associated with certain cognitive benefits, like improvements in working memory and response inhibition, and even some social advantages through cooperation in multiplayer games.
But the key word there is moderate, right?
Absolutely. Excessive engagement in gaming can lead to significant real-world impairment in crucial areas like school performance and interpersonal relationships. And estimates suggest that a notable percentage of adolescent boys experience substantial problems directly related to excessive video game engagement. And as we touched on earlier, there's this significant opportunity cost, right? So time spent heavily gaming often comes at the direct expense of crucial activities like sleep, physical exercise, and face-to-face social interaction.
So we've explored the mental health and the social impacts of this, but Haidt also delves into this fascinating area that he calls the spiritual impact of this phone-based existence, and that's an intriguing dimension to consider.
It is. So he posits that the constant engagement with the digital worlds can inadvertently hinder or undermine practices that foster a deeper sense of well-being and connection on this more profound level. And he identifies 6 spiritual practices that he argues are particularly challenged by the modern digital environment.
Okay, so let's walk through those. So the first is shared sacredness. What does that entail?
Right. So drawing on the foundational work of sociologist Emil Durkheim, this concept refers to the way in which communal rituals and shared experiences create this sense of cohesion and belonging within groups by shifting individuals into this collective awareness of the sacred as distinct from their profane everyday consciousness. And Haidt argues that the virtual world, lacking this inherent structure of shared time and physical space, struggles to effectively provide these kinds of deeply shared sacred experiences that are essential for building strong community bonds and a sense of collective identity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which makes a lot of sense. There's a qualitatively different feeling to participating in a ritual or a ceremony together in person, compared to simply being part of an online group or a forum. So what's the second spiritual practice that's impacted?
The second one is embodiment. So many religious and spiritual rituals involve physical movement and synchronous action with others, which fosters this powerful sense of bonding and shared experience. So think about the act of sharing a meal together in a religious context, or engaging in synchronized movements during a ceremony. The virtual world, by its very nature, is disembodied, and the majority of online interactions are asynchronous. So they lack this crucial element of shared physical presence and movement.
Okay. And the third is stillness, silence, and focus. And these certainly feel like they're increasingly rare commodities in our digitally saturated world.
Exactly. And many spiritual traditions across the globe emphasize practices like meditation and contemplative prayer as ways to, quiet the mind and cultivate inner peace and well-being. And even secular mindfulness practices, have demonstrated significant benefits. But the phone-based life is this constant barrage of notifications, alerts, digital stimulation, constantly fragmenting our attention and training us to perpetually seek external validation and stimulation from our devices.
And the fourth practice is self-transcendence, which is, the ability to move beyond an excessive focus on oneself and connect with something larger. So how does the digital world potentially hinder this?
Yeah. So spirituality often involves a reduction of self-focus and a sense of connection to something beyond the individual ego. But social media is heavily centered on self-presentation, personal branding, and this constant comparison of one's social standing with others. So it's
Yeah.
almost perfectly engineered to keep our attention directed inward on ourselves and our perceived place in the social hierarchy, and thereby hindering that essential sense of self-transcendence and interconnectedness.
Yeah. The fifth practice centers around our interactions with others, and it's being slow to anger, quick to forgive. And that feels particularly relevant in the often polarized and sometimes anonymous environment of online interactions.
It is, and most major religious and ethical traditions advise us to cultivate this quality of patience and forgiveness. However, social media often seems to encourage rapid judgments, and it could easily amplify feelings of anger and outrage. And the asynchronous nature of online communication and the potential for anonymity can also make the process of extending forgiveness and repairing relationships much more challenging in online conflicts.
And then the final spiritual practice is finding awe in nature. And we consistently hear about the numerous, mental and emotional benefits of spending time outdoors.
We do. So experiencing awe, particularly in the natural world, has been shown to have a wide range of well-being benefits, including a reduction in self-focused thinking, an increase in pro-social behavior and generosity, and this greater sense of meaning and purpose in life. So the often artificial and predominantly indoor nature of a phone-based activity stands in stark contrast to the restorative and awe-inspiring power of the natural world. He even shares a compelling anecdote about assigning all walks to his students, and the surprisingly profound positive impact it had on their overall sense of well-being.
Yeah, it's truly fascinating how these, ancient understandings of spiritual well-being directly intersect with the very modern challenges posed by our increasingly digital lives.
It really underscores how this great rewiring isn't simply about technological advancements.
Yeah.
It profoundly touches upon fundamental aspects of the human experience and our innate needs for connection, for meaning, for well-being.
So we've clearly identified the problem. It's multifaceted. But what about potential, solutions? So he talks about the critical need for what he calls collective action. So what exactly does he mean by that term in this context?
Right. So he's referring to situations that economists often call collective action problems or social dilemmas. So these are scenarios where individual choices, even if they seem rational or beneficial at the individual level, can collectively lead to negative outcomes for the group as a whole. So think about the example of preteens feeling a strong social pressure to get smartphones, because everyone else has one, even though it might be collectively better for their development if no one in that age group had them yet.
So it's like the social dynamic where individual desires can lead to a worse outcome for everyone involved.
Exactly. And to break free from these negative cycles, coordinated efforts and agreements at a broader level are likely necessary. And Haidt emphasizes that effective solutions will likely involve, governments considering appropriate regulations, tech companies reevaluating their design ethics, schools implementing thoughtful policies, and parents establishing clear boundaries and fostering real-world engagement.
So it sounds like meaningfully addressing this great rewiring is going to demand a truly multifaceted and collaborative approach across various sectors of society.
Absolutely. It's not a challenge that any single individual or institution can effectively tackle in isolation.
So to bring it all together for you, this deep dive into the anxious generation has illuminated a really significant and fundamental shift in the way that children and adolescents are growing up today. There's a great rewiring of childhood driven by the rapid and pervasive adoption of smartphones and social media, alongside this parallel decrease in opportunities for real-world autonomy and play is having these, profound and wide-ranging consequences.
Yeah. The implications of this great rewiring are significant and far-reaching, affecting young people's, mental health, their social development, and even their spiritual lives in these deeply impactful ways.
And it's clear that this is not a simple issue with easy answers. It has deep roots in technological advancements and societal shifts, and its implications will likely continue to unfold in the years to come. And so this inevitably leads us to this crucial question for all of us to consider, which is, given all this compelling evidence, what are the most important shifts that we need to thoughtfully consider in our overall approach to raising and educating, the next generation in this rapidly evolving digital age?
Right.
And maybe even, on a more personal level, what practical changes might be the most impactful in finding a healthier and more sustainable balance between the immersive virtual world and
Yeah.